Our next presentation, which is going to start in just a minute, is going to be advanced filtering presented by our lead engineer, Ben Wake. So I want to thank you, Ben, for joining us. It is officially 12:30, so why don't I hand things over to you, Ben?
All right. Thank you, Brandon. Welcome, everybody, to my relatively brief discourse on filtering in Quantrix. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ben Wake. I'm the lead developer for the modeler team, the desktop offering. And I am really excited to talk about some of the capabilities that you may already be using. And if so, I hope I can lend a little insight into how you can perhaps tweak them a little better. And if you aren't already using them, maybe I can offer you some ways that you can be using them. So I wanted to start off with a brief disclaimer. This is a cooking show. Lindsay did a little bit of this as well. I am going to be doing a certain amount of, here's one I prepared earlier. Filtering is complicated. Just like formulas, you don't always get it right on your first try. And especially for my last example, I'm going to be pasting in an expression that I did not write on the first try. So I want to make sure that people are not getting terribly discouraged if they are having a little bit of trouble getting this kind of thing working. And I want to encourage you, if you have any feedback, if you have any ideas for how to make it easier, how to make it more intuitive, how to make it do what you want and not what you don't want, we would always love to hear them. So with that disclaimer out of the way, I'm going to talk briefly about my agenda here. So the first thing I want to do is talk about how I classify filters. This isn't official nomenclature. It's just my personal way of thinking about things. I'm going to talk briefly about item filters, something we introduced relatively recently into Quantrix, but is already out there in the app and many people already know about and are already using them. And I'm going to use that to sort of segue between user filters and structural filters, because almost all advanced filtering is structural. From there, I'm going to walk into role-based filtering. You already saw that happening in Lindsay's model, but I'm going to peel back the curtain a little bit and show you what that might look like in practice for your model. And then I'm going to talk about, with an example, of relationship-based filtering. And that particular example is going to use something that I call a filter matrix. And again, this is a technique that I didn't invent. Many of our customers are already using it. You may already be using it. But I do want to talk about what its advantages and disadvantages are compared to simply using an expression-based filter directly. So that will then transition me to my last couple of examples, and those will be about time-based filtering, which is always a little bit tricky. And hopefully it will give you some cool ideas about what you can potentially do to get the time-based filtering that you so desperately desire in your model. So I'm more of a hands-on kind of guy, so I'm going to switch over to sharing my Quantrix modeler as I talk about these examples and start walking through stuff. Just to make sure everybody's seeing my Quantrix, can I get a thumbs up in the chat, please? Excellent. Thank you, Franz. All right. So I divide filters up personally into user filters and structural filters. And these are names that I came up with. They aren't anything special. You might think of them as permanent or temporary filters. You might think of them as modeling filters and on-the-fly filters. You might think of them, user filters as slice and dice filters, however you choose to think of them. Some filters are designed for once the model has already been built, once it's already put out in the world, once your boss is breathing down your neck and you're in the middle of a presentation and he says, boy, I'd really like to see just this piece of it. And then you have to quick scramble to show him just the piece that he wants to see. Other filters, and that's going to be the bulk of what I talk about today, are more permanent. They're sort of a part of the model. You bake them in, you put some thought into them. You apply them once and you probably just leave them there forever. And they tend to be used more to leave out things that are never pertinent. And so I am going to start with an example of something that is a user filter, which I think is really neat, really handy. But I'm going to quickly transition over to structural filters. So user filters, we have long had a filter tray. And the way the filter tray works, and I'm sure most of you already know this, is that you can change what data you're looking at by making a selection in the filter tray. You can choose exactly one item from each category on the filter tray. You must choose one. You can't not choose one. And for years, I had people come up to me and say, Ben, I would really like to be able to select multiple things in the filter tray. And my first thought was, before I started thinking about the design complications of it, what a good idea. I want that too. Who doesn't want that? And the problem is, there are a lot of different ways we can display that data. So suppose I allowed you to select the year 2022 and 2023 from here. No problem. But what would it look like? It could look like this. Maybe you want 2022 and 2023 on the outside of accounts. Maybe you want it on the inside of accounts. Maybe you want it in your columns underneath your data. Maybe you want it over your data. And this is a very simple matrix. This matrix only has two categories on its row and column trays. And so what I started to think was, we already have a way to express where do I want this? You put it on the row tray or the column tray where you want it. What if we could build into the category tile, each tile, the fact that you want it to be filterable? So I'm going to assume that we want it in this particular place, and I'm going to pop open the item filter. The item filter shows up when you start to hover over it. It's the little filtering icon, and it offers you a tree view. So if I only want to look at 2022 and 2023, a thing that I almost always do is start by turning off everything I don't want and turning on the things that I do want. And so now I have 2022 and 2023, and I have them presumably where I want them. If I didn't want them there, I could put them there. And as soon as I want to get rid of that filter, I can just click here and the filter is gone. One place where I think this really shines is in if you have groups. So suppose I only want to look at Asia. I don't want to look at North America. Boom, just Asia. Want to bring it back? No problem. Great. So I'm sure a lot of you have already seen this. I really wanted this to just be a brief recap, but there's one aspect of these filters that I'm not sure that everybody's aware of, and that kind of blurs the lines a little bit. It's more of a structural filter and less of a user filter, but I think it's really, really useful sometimes. So I'm going to make a really quick example here. Suppose I have a category, and the category has a summary item. And I have this category in the filter tray somewhere, and I want the user to be able to select any of these things, but I don't want them to be able to select the summary item. Well, then I can deselect the summary item, and that will change the list of things that I have. So the user filter is still there. The user can choose any of these items, but I have applied a structural filter that says, hey, let's limit the options of the user, not because we want to like hide things from them or keep things secret, but because we want to simplify the view. We want to reduce it down to its bare essentials so that only the things that are pertinent to them are what they see. And that's a really common theme that we'll see throughout these structural filters. And so, you know, maybe it's not the summary item, maybe it's even further and you really only want those, or this is a really simple example, but if you want to, you just know that you can do some searching in here, which can be really helpful if your stuff is long. I do actually want to take a step back. I forgot to talk about this and show a quick pitfall with the search. If I only want to see consolidated, obviously I can unselect everything and select consolidated. Great. The problem is that if consolidated is one of a large number of things, and I want to search down to consolidated and only see consolidated, a temptation might be to start with search. And what I would encourage you is to get in the habit of always saying, turn everything off and then search, and then choose consolidate. Because if you don't do that, what will happen is that you will search for consolidated. You'll go to turn everything off, and it will only turn off consolidate. Because when you have constraint to a search, all of these operate only on what you see, which may feel a little weird in this example, and may in fact be, but if you want, I don't know, everything that has an A in it, and you want to turn off all of these things, it's really handy to be able to turn off those things and not affect the state of anything that you don't already see. So a quick little pitfall, but a very powerful feature, and one that I really appreciate having, and hopefully you do too. So moving on from the item filters. The thing that I started to talk about with the structural filters, there are a lot of different ways and reasons for structural filters. There are a lot of different reasons you might want them. There are a lot of different ways to start building them. And I'm going to start with the example for Lindsay's model, which is actually a fairly complex one as such things go. But I think it's really, really powerful, and I think it's really helpful. So again, cooking show, here's one I prepared earlier. I've already built this matrix. And this matrix just lists off a bunch of people and a bunch of accounts and says, here are the people that are associated with this account. And so I have an input canvas. And the thing that I want to do in here is I want to say, depending on who I'm logged into the model as, if I log in as Rajesh, I want to see only the accounts associated with Rajesh. If I log in as Nala, I want to see only Nala's accounts. And so this is step one to setting that up. I built a category that contains all of those roles, and I've associated it with the accounts that are appropriate. And one of the things that you'll see is, while these are input cells, I can make changes. You can also use formulas to fill this in, which can be really helpful. And a key aspect to this, a thing that can be very frustrating if you don't think to do it, is you probably want to make sure you have one for Modeler for when you are in the process of actually building this. So now that I've done this, I want to show you the other piece that I have pre-prepared, which is that I've already set up a role for each of these. And I've associated a perspective with that role so that I don't get horrible jumping around every time I switch roles. So here I have my input, and it's unfiltered. And the thing that I want to have is, based on who's logged in, I want to see only the accounts that are associated. So I am going to add a filter. And the filter I'm going to add is an expression filter that looks like this. Select from people where the names of the people are the role name environment variable. And this is already not the world's most user-friendly, but it's relatively straightforward. What I'm saying is, I want to select the role name that corresponds to the item name of people, and I want to grab out of it the Boolean value, the true or false, the checkbox from that matrix. And then, and this is the real magic of Quantrix, this, as far as I'm concerned, is the single best piece of Quantrix of anything at all. Things that I don't talk about, I want Quantrix to either ignore or handle, depending on whether they're linked or not. So I'm going to ignore year and month with this particular filter because I don't mention it. Quantrix, just do the same thing for every year and for every month. Whereas for every account, Quantrix automatically handled that. It's linked between this matrix and this other matrix. And so what I want you to do is go do a lookup that we call it slices between these two different matrices based on that category. And you could have a bunch more categories doing this. And then the result that this returns back is either the yes or no from that people matrix. And if it's yes, then we are going to see it. And if it's no, we aren't. So when I hit OK, nothing interesting at all is going to happen. Ta-da! And the reason that nothing interesting happened is because I'm logged in as model. And if we look back here, modeler has permission to see everything. And therefore, modeler is not going to filter anything out. But if you look at the data that, but if we switch roles, then we will see something a little bit different. So I'm going to switch roles to, let's say, Nala. And what we'll see is that Nala is associated with Fortune and Wells. And if we double check, yes, indeed, Nala is associated with Fortune and Wells. If I switch roles to Kwame, Kwame is associated with Smith, Fortune and Wells. Yes, indeed, Smith, Fortune and Wells. And one of the cool things is that this is instantly responsive. If I add Fisher to Kwame and jump over here, you'll see that Fisher is immediately filtered in. If I go back in and take it out and make more changes, well, I can't make changes in that particular instance because these are calculated. But if I were in a different you'll see that immediately it changes, it updates, the filter is live. And so that's basically the concept of role-based filter. The only tricky bit, and there's a big asterisk here, and I may come back and talk about this later during the Ask an Expert session, is you do want to make sure that with role-based filtering, that you only use role name in the expression. You do not want to use role name in your formulas. And again, I will, if I have time, talk about that more later. So that was role-based filtering. I'm going to switch back to the modeler role. And I am going to move on to relationship filtering. So again, here's one I prepared earlier. I have some data in here that associates these accounts along these data items with these incredibly well-named attributes, options, what have you. And so you can see if you select different ones of these, that some of them are associated with some subset and others are associated with other subset. Rich, I will be happy to talk about that more later. But this is not the time for it. So where was I? I was saying that each of these is associated with some subset of the available options. And this is really common in real world scenarios. CPQ is a really excellent example of this. Maybe if I select that I have an extra long chassis, that means that I have to have at least 3 axles. But if I select a compact chassis or say even a motorcycle, then I have no full length axles. And so it's often the case that you want to associate some subset of options with some subset of other configurations. And so what I've done is put that in the matrix. And I absolutely love these checkboxes for Booleans. You could, again, use formulas to populate some of these. I've done it more or less at random. And what I've done is lined it up. So the data that actually lives in here corresponds to the selections that are here. So that once I apply this filter, we'll be able to look and see, yes, it's doing the thing that we expect it to do. Now, this filter may seem like it ought to be complicated, but it isn't, or at least I hope it isn't. I hope you can learn to not think of it as complicated. This filter is already built. Every piece of it. There's nothing more that we need in terms of logic. Again, in Quantrix, any category you don't mention will be ignored if it's not linked. In other words, we do the same thing across all of it, or it will be sliced if it is. So when I look at this, what I see is these can be ignored. You can do the same thing across all of them. These are linked, and therefore you can do the same thing across all of them. And these are linked, and therefore the value from the filter indicates what the value should be for the filter. And what that means is that the filter itself, if I click on the right thing, is very simple. Oops, although I do want to put it in the right place. Sorry about that. What I was saying was that the goal of this example is to filter these things for these things. And so you can see really clearly here which should be eliminated. And one thing I do want to mention really quickly is we do have hide empty rows. If this is literally all you want to do, hide empty rows is a great choice. You don't have to build a filter matrix. You don't have to do anything. But if your relationship is a little more complicated, if it doesn't perfectly correspond, and if you want to be able to do something like turn on possibilities for fortune so that you can put data in it, then a technique like this can be really powerful. And so here's what that looks like. The expression is just account options filter. Boom. And I don't know how much to belabor this point. Many of you, I'm sure, have already completely gotten it, and others of you may need to ponder it for a little bit. But basically, this matrix is the filter. It has a shared category and another shared category for the lookup, right? So this category says, here are the rows. Do I want them on or off? And this category says, under what conditions do I want them on or off? And so when I look at this display, as I select the particular options, it's doing a live lookup, and we basically get exactly what we want from it. So that leads me on to my next sort of topic, which is, should we use one of these filter matrices? And some of our customers do, some of our customers don't. My last two examples won't, but I think they're a really good idea a lot of the time, and I wanted to briefly discuss the pros and cons of that. So, using a filter matrix can be easier to read. Boy, if I need to know whether Mart is associated with things, I can look at this filter matrix and just see that it is. Whereas if it's off in some logic in a filter, maybe it isn't as easy to see. It can be, under some circumstances, faster to put your filter in a matrix like this, to use formulas to perform your logic rather than to use expressions. And the reason for that is formulas are extremely carefully tuned to only reevaluate when something changes. Whereas filter expressions need to calculate anytime you nudge the view. It needs to go look up whether this item should be visible or not under these circumstances. So it can be faster, it can be easier to read, and it can be much easier to debug. Debugging expressions is just unfortunately a bummer. Hopefully one day we'll have a chance to figure out a cleaner, better way to do it, but you can't use the dependency inspector on expressions. The expression editor is not as robust and easy to use as the formula editor. It's much harder to understand what you're getting out of it, because with a formula, you get a value. If the value says, oh, in this cell, I have an error value, great, I can look at that error value and say, oh, it's a size error. My select must have different size lists in my key list and my value list. Whereas in an expression, the filter just doesn't work. And you look at it, you don't necessarily know why. So whenever I'm getting confused about the result of an expression, the first thing I do is turn it into a formula so that I can debug it better. And then the last advantage that I can think of for a filter matrix is that it can function as its own user filter interface. Suppose that whatever was going on here, you wanted the user to be able to make changes to it. Well, you can just slap this on a canvas and they can click these checkboxes. Or in 23.3, they can make a selection and hit spacebar, and that will multi-select across those checkboxes, a feature that I found very useful in building this model. So those are the reasons why you might want to use a filter that is built into a matrix. Why don't you want to use a filter that's built into a matrix? Well, I think in general, I often do. The biggest reasons that I wouldn't want to do it would be, one, it adds additional mental overhead. If your expression is simple, or your expression really does contain all of the logic, just tuck it away out of view of everything else. Don't make an entry in the model browser. Don't add extra cells. Don't add extra mental overhead. Now, speaking of entries in the model browser, there are ways to mitigate that. You can stick your filters off in a folder. That's a thing that I often do. Depending on how your model is set up, if you have different users that log in, you may want to, just to simplify things for them, set up their permissions so that they can't see the filters. Obviously, that won't work if you want to use it as the interface the way I just described. But oftentimes you don't. Oftentimes you want to set it up as a pure structural filter, and then just set it and forget it and have users not have to worry about it. So if you say you can't see the view, then they don't have to worry about it. And then the last thing was the memory there. And there's a saying in computer science, don't prematurely optimize. If you have a model and your model is taking up way too much memory and it's slow and you're having problems, absolutely look for where you can clean things up. If you're not having those problems, probably don't borrow trouble. And as Brad mentioned in his new and next, coming in 23.3, these matrices take up even less memory. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to think about it. They just will. It just takes less memory because of optimizations that we make. And then, of course, the last reason not to use a filter matrix is the thing that I alluded to before, and by popular demand, we'll be talking about later, which is you do not want to use it with role name. You want to put role name in the expression and not in a form one. And therefore, you don't want to try and do that kind of filtering by using the filter matrix. So that's the concept of filter matrices. And so I'm going to move on, and I'll have to be pretty quick because I'm running quickly out of time because I talk too much, to the last couple examples, which are both about filtering time. So if I go to this display here, and what this is just this historical account data graphed for each of these accounts, I will notice that all of these accounts stop right here, at least. And the reason they stop right here is because so does time. None of these accounts have historical data that extends past November 2023 for the simple reason that November 2023 is right now. If they had data that was after that, it wouldn't be historical, it would be forecast or possibly made up. To the extent there's a difference, I suppose. So this gets especially bad, making your graphs kind of ugly, if, as it happens, for good reasons elsewhere in your model, you want to add additional future years. So if I added those years and I go back to the display, you'll see that all of these end up getting sort of really cramped in, and you'd really like to have them stop at the time. So if you're in this situation, there is a relatively straightforward thing that you can do. There are two things you need to know in order to filter on time with a chart on a canvas. And the first one is how to filter a chart on the canvas, which isn't necessarily 100% straightforward. A chart that's off a canvas is much simpler. You just apply the filter to the data table. But on a canvas, you have to know to show the table view because that's the place that you can apply the filter. So here, if I go to apply filter, then I can put an expression filter, but I need to know what that expression is going to look like. And in order to figure out how to filter this, the other thing I need to talk about is how do I turn time categories into a date? Dates are really handy in Quantrix. You can use them to compare two different dates, and it will compare just like it's numbers. It's really straightforward. But when what you're doing is filtering, you first need to translate between items along time into translate from items along time into dates. And there are three ways that I know of to do this. One of them is to use the timeline date function. This only applies if you're using a timeline, and it only applies generally if you are building a filter matrix. And again, for these examples, I'm not going to be building a filter matrix, partly because I am already over time. But the but the other two are date and date value. And really quickly, both of them are a little bit clunky. And if you have great ideas about how we can fix this, we'd love to hear them. I'm going to be using date value here. Just know that if you use date instead, which expects a number for the year, you either have to use the index and add the first year, or you have to wrap the name of the item in a value. And then you have to use index per month, etc. So that's not what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be basically hacking it. And what I'm going to say is date value of the name of the month. You have to type it correctly. The name of the month and the first day of the month and the name of the year. So that's how I convert from category items to date values. And then what I want is that value, that time, is less than, well, now. And that's the magic. It really is that simple. If I want to only see up to November 2023, all I have to do is use the now function in there. Today would also work totally fine. They're roughly equivalent in this circumstance because you're dealing with dates rather than with times. The thing that makes this truly magical is not possible to demonstrate on this presentation because I can't make time pass fast enough, although I imagine that I make it seem like it does. And that is that when you proceed into December, your charts will automatically jump forward one. When you proceed into January, they'll automatically jump forward one. As long as what you want is actually before now, you never have to touch it again. It just automatically works, and it works perfectly. So again, I'm over time. I'm going to rush through this last one, but hopefully it's a neat one as well. If I go back to this input, you'll notice if well, actually, I'm gonna look at the display. You'll notice that some of these accounts only have data starting at a certain time, and some of them only have data going up to a certain time. And that's a really common real-world scenario. You have an opening date and a closing date for an account. And so what I've done is I have built a matrix that says the opening date and the closing date for the account. And then what I want to do in here is, in addition to the role-based filter, I also want to filter down so that as we select a specific date, we only see the places where the accounts are currently open for that date. And this is a real, I would have loved to have spent more time justifying this, but I'm going to just paste it in because I talk too much. And yes, that looks complicated. Yes, I can break it down potentially later in the Ask an Expert session if people are interested. I also have a script in here that lets me walk through time, but you can see that if I jump back beginning of time here, we have no accounts. We walk forward. The Smith account opens. We hang out for a while in Smith. Then Fortune shows up. Then Smith gets closed. And then more come in. And these accounts are still open. They're open and they don't have a close date associated with them. So even as we walk forward into the future, we don't see them disappear because the filter doesn't apply. So sorry about rushing that last bit, but thank you all very much for your time. And I look very much forward to seeing your questions on this and or other topics in the Ask an Expert session. Thanks, everybody.